Hello and welcome. I'm Lee Peterson. I'm the host of the weekly podcast, WDcast, which is called WDcast because it's brought to you by WD Partners, also known as Thinkers That Do, which means services that range from strategy, design, digital, and operations to architecture and even construction management. A lot of great clients, and you can visit WD Partners at wdpartners.com. And just a second about this show and WDcast. The discussions that we have revolve around relevant business topics. So we don't necessarily care what business or what type of business, but they have to be the burning platforms of the 21st century and the plethora of challenges involved. And as that word itself suggests, there's a lot to talk about. So today, we're going to talk about some of the key factors of leadership and dealing with human beings in general, which is, an age-old conundrum. But I can't do it alone, so I have with me the intelligent, he's rolling his eyes, energetic, the always thinking and super positive Andy House. Andy is a key member of the WD design team, a creative director, and an enthusiast on all things design, which makes talking to him a really good idea. Andy, how are you doing today?
Always awesome. Thank you.
Always awesome?
Always awesome, yeah.
So double A.
Yeah.
A little disclaimer before we start. The thoughts and opinions expressed today belong to the members of this discussion and do not necessarily represent those of the companies that they work for, which in this case is the same one. Okay, Andy,
Yeah.
You have a really varied background that I recall Abercrombie and things like that. And so could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Like how'd you get here in this black room?
Gosh, it's a comfortable room too. There's been something that always fascinated me about making something out of nothing. And I think it was probably when I was in third grade and I said, hey, I want to be an architect. I thought that would be cool to build buildings, make art.
Third grade, really?
Third grade,
Wow.
I know. So I got to college and I thought, I've always been drawing and making stuff out of paint and creating stuff that I thought could be valuable to other people. And I thought, well, I could go to art school. And I said, well, there's something intellectual about building something that has a purpose and a space for people and environment and experience. So I chose architecture and design instead of art. So I got to a point in my career where I thought architecture was the cool thing, but I had an experience as one of my first jobs as in retail, actually, in the back room of the Express store at Eastland Mall. So I was processing clothing.
I think I've been there.
Yeah. Working, to see how, retail affects the customer and, products coming in and out, seeing people, I would kind of go out on the floor every so often. There was 25 girls and one guy, which was really interesting. I was in the back of the store working in the stock room. But I was 17 and something hit me about how I've always taken what I think that art and the idea around building a space for people to buy something and consumerism in general. And I thought that maybe there's a path for design and spaces for retail. And it was, after a couple of these co-ops I had at the University of Cincinnati, I realized that retail was, when I had the chance to work with limited brands back then, that this was a great avenue. I kind of bypassed it at first, and at one point on the one day, Abercrombie & Fitch came knocking on the door for me to come in as a designer, and I took the challenge and went a long way with them for about 11 years, and learned a lot in that process. And in that time, I had created a lot of experiences, I guess, opening doors for myself and with the company in general as we went globally, and had a lot of experiences overseas, and found that the cultures that really drive and shape the world of retail and just human beings in general really captivated my mind and made me start to think bigger. So I think ultimately with those ideas of being able to work with humans and then ultimately direct them led me to a position here that I think suited me well. And WD was probably when I think and started talking to people here, ultimately everybody has this capacity to work well with humans and be emotionally connected. So I think that's kind of what landed me in this spot right now.
And so exactly what is it that you do here at WD?
Well, I guess I consider myself as a translator, and in the way that I translate what people are wanting to, what I guess from a sense of clients, what are they trying to get out of what they do, what their brand is speaking to people, how do they assess the consumerism underneath their umbrella of products or services, and translate then kind of what they need into an actual item and executing an experience or an environment that hosts the best way to put them forward apart from their competition. So I think that when we look at what all clients are looking for and striving for today in business, it really is how do they push themselves beyond the competitors? How do they get their vision out there? And it's really a translation of how we see this across, because you do a slice across all industries. We have the opportunity here at WD to work with multiple industries, and seeing how other points of connections could work better for a client in their situation.
So you mentioned art school.
Yeah.
Like you almost wound up there. My daughter went there, and a lot of my relatives went to different art schools. I remember leading design groups and telling people distinctly, like, what we're doing here, this is commercial art. So, to your point, we're talking about what are the parameters of the brand? Like, you have to create something that works, that's going to move this brand, not necessarily your portfolio.
Right.
So my expression was always, that stuff that you're doing right there, that'd be great in your basement. And then what you've got to do for this brand is got to fit sort of into that slot. Yeah. Do you agree with that philosophy?
100%. So, everybody as artists, I think it's a very subjective thing. There are taste levels that everybody kind of are born with or experience through their environment and the way that they're brought up, the way they see the world in different colors and different fashions that others don't constantly see day to day in their own life. And that's where it's like connecting with humans in a way on an empathetic level is where I've become thinking more and more daily in this job that is the essence of taking what is subjective through art and looking at it objectively towards a certain action and problem solving. And from a sense of what you're saying at art school, I think you pick up a lot of, and I didn't go to art school, and that was one thing that's one of my biggest regrets. And looking at the sense of art for how do you look at beautification and how, I guess, brands could be portrayed. You got to take your sense of self out of it and what you think is beautiful. You're on your own, and really think about what is the perspective of art that others are seeing, and what are the colors that they're seeing. There's a whole lot of selflessness that goes into the work that we do and what I do specifically. In the end, you have to be subjective as a leader in design, because ultimately you can't work off of objective views and perspective taking from a client and only working what they're telling you to do, because that they're hiring us to kind of decipher and augment and think then, okay, you've got an idea here. Ultimately, it's going to have to come out some certain way. You've got to apply your sense of intuitive art making, and so there is a subjective level ultimately, and there's an art that is, I guess, in my head, but I can't assume what I see from the very beginning is what the answer is. I have to dissect, I have to listen, I have to be in their shoes, and that's what empathy is all about.
Yeah, I think, and I know we want to talk about that, but I think that's, I remember starting several projects, and you go on a dive and you listen to what the client says or what the brand is all about. And I remember coming home with the team and the team going, what are we going to do? Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of that revolves around like, okay, let's start with square one, and when you start to go through the process, of how you're going to get from A to B to B to C and on down the road, and eventually to Z, you start to think of the things that could be great solutions. So I think a lot of that art sort of develops into commercial art as you go through the process. And you're trying to figure out. We used to laugh and talk about like objectives. Like we always put, what are the objectives of this project? And it was always the same thing. And we just want to sell more stuff, and and put in different voices and different terminology.
Yeah.
But anyway, you touched on empathy, and I know that's something that you want to talk about today.
So I think when you look at empathy, it's it can be misconstrued as an effective way of and approaching a conversation with someone, and that it's really like you're really helping others through the way of consoling them, and it's really more of just a level of understanding and sympathizing with them. But when we look at I look at everybody that does the job we do very well here, it's their collective cognitive empathy. So it's the way that your brain assesses things and finds ways to make connections and collect those dots of different points of perspective, and is able to then relate to a way of performing an execution that is, I guess, brought to life by a series of events that are, in a way, always hearkening back to a strategy that is brought through the shoes of the consumer, through the shoes of the client. And so it's the cognitive empathy that we all are, I think, embodying here as leaders. And so what I think is interesting here is I've talked to other people in this office about the subject of cognitive empathy. I see more and more that we ultimately have hired the right people, the right leaders that have this sense of empathy, and I think are growing into the shoes of being a better empathic leader.
Yeah, I think it's a two-way street, right? In one sense, you have to develop a sense of empathy for the client.
Yep.
I mean, what are they going through? And I remember somebody told me once, we're like grandparents. We come in here and we take their little baby and we go, this is really nice, and here's some things for you, and see you later. Mm-hmm. But they actually live with that baby. So that, there has to be some empathy for what the client is, what they're going through, what they need. And really that can come down to a really personal level. Like this guy's worried about his job.
Yeah.
And if we don't help, he's sticking his neck out by hiring us to a degree. Mm-hmm. And if we're not successful, he's not going to be successful. He's going to get fired, or he could get replaced or whatever. So there's the client part about empathy, but then also the team.
The team side, yep. So I think when I look at both, and I think it's most important to really think about your team first. So being what I consider myself as an affiliative leader, I guess, is described as someone who's always listening to the team first, understanding their perspectives first. Again, common theme of empathy. But ultimately guides and directs them by the way of their combined strengths, understanding their weaknesses all the time, and finding ways that you can collectively lead the team by problem solving, listening to them first, always talking last is an important way when you look at your team. And then when we look at the way that how do you work with clients in that realm, affiliative leadership is really taking the perspective of the client first, listening to what is hurting on their side, what are the pain points of their customer, looking at what the pain points are of their team, and kind of assessing the same way you do with your own team.
I think what's interesting about empathy too is, to your point, you listen and then you speak last. Sometimes you'll hear, when you empathize with somebody, whether it's a client or a team member, and you're thinking, okay, I understand where you're coming from, but that's wrong. Mm-hmm. So there's that part too,
that's
where
exactly right.
it becomes part of our job sometimes, and then part of our role as a human being to say, let's talk about that, because that might not be the right thing to do right now, whatever that might be.
Right. Totally. I think one of the big things that we offer here at WD, and I've seen this group build in a very fascinating way is our strategy team here. The process that we put together and looking at insights and data and industry trends and all of that and collecting all of this information, ultimately making stabs at trying to collect as much stakeholder feedback as possible, listening to the customer through testing. That whole bucket of what we do here is so empathetically driven. And like it's ultimately like this system that we always go back to from as designers, as the strategy, as the why. And we've done it very organically here. I mean, we've been hiring the right people, obviously, but we've been doing it in a way we've gained momentum on every project for the last few years. And I think it's the most solid part of empathy here at WD is by having that group of people that are always listening, always breeding the ideas, staying at the top of, I guess, the pinnacle of where the next vision of retail is going. And it gives us the leverage as designers to always have something to go back and stand upon.
So do you have an example maybe of what you're talking about?
I guess the biggest example is we create a strategic outline and we'll create a narrative. And the narrative is typically, I guess, like a tone. It's a mixture of things. A tone of voice that really embodies the brand who we may be working with. And that tone of voice communicates to the whole team, back to the client, kind of what is the overall vision, what is the overall feeling that you're getting for the quest we're taking to a certain problem-solving element. And ultimately, it's that emotion, it's that feeling that gives you. It also aligns with their set of brand guidelines. And you always think about the branding and how that works through this. And it's like when you can take a brand and you can take a narrative and an outline and emotion and tie back colors, tie back words, tie back imagery, back to that narrative and that strategy outline, you're always going to be able to come to an outcome of a design that can drive back to that narrative, back to that story, back to those colors. And that's, I think, by having this this group of strategy-led, insights-led thinkers and business-minded people to work with in our creative teams, that's ultimately, like, again, the best way if I could describe empathy in our office. When I look outside the industry, and I think hospitality is one of those market segments that we work with a little bit here too, and it drives right along with retail. I think an example there, I always go back to Danny Meyer, and he's awesome at what he does and what he's done for hospitality in general with Union Square Hospitality Group. He really has the sensibility around putting their team first, looking at ways that they make the consumer and their guests feel. And ultimately, I think one of the examples that comes to my head too around Danny Myers is, and I've never experienced dining here, but at 11 Madison Park in New York, it's the top-rated favorite restaurant in New York continuously. They actually developed something there in the restaurant. I don't know if you guys heard about the Dreamweaver. Have you heard about the Dreamweaver?
Yeah, it seems like I've read about
something. Read about it? Okay. Yeah, so it's a great example of empathy here. What I guess a story that I could relate to have heard about this Dreamweaver is that a group once sat down, it was a couple, sat down the first time in New York ever. They'd been in New York for 5 or 6 days. This was their last night. They got a reservation here for 11 Madison Park. So excited to come to dinner, and it's multiple courses coming to their table. Their waiter is also driven by empathy, just like the whole brand and company is. Was assessing what they were talking about, and knew that this was their last night. He ordered the Dreamweaver, who is a separate function, and sometimes it's a waiter. It's also functioning as a cross communicator throughout the restaurant and working with all of the other staff. Yeah. But he told the Dreamweaver to come over and listen in a little bit too. And the couple at one point, I think it was like course 3 or so, they're like, "Oh, we never had a slice of real New York style pizza." And like that was one thing they kind of regretted along their trip here in New York. And the Dreamweaver immediately went out, ordered the best pizza they can think of, and had 2 slices put into the kitchen. I think it was like course 5 or something. They brought out the slices of pizza, unknown to the actual guests there that was going to happen as part of their courses. So, it's really listening to and surprising and delighting your teammates. It's surprising and delighting based on the emotions that you're feeling from the other side, on the client side. That makes us, I think, our work really exciting, and it ultimately makes the connections with our clients longer lasting.
That's interesting. So for the empathetic view, new people, somebody comes on board here, WD, what do you talk to them about in terms of this?
So I think it's always good to really, when I look at how we hire and how we bring people in here, I love looking at their emotional state first. I think it always is important to have someone who has a high EQ rating, emotional intelligence rating. That's really first before skill set. And when I personally, because I like to interview with other people and see how they take in the same room to the emotional state of the person and the skill sets, how they can describe things, how they can communicate. But from a personal level, I do like to have that sense of like, how are they assessing the world? How are they feeling about design in general versus just what can they do on paper? What can they do head down? So I think, emotional intelligence and that ability to feel, to be empathetic to the environment, to clients is always first in my mind. And so I even look at people right out of school that have a lot of the sensitivities around emotional intelligence, and it's interesting because a lot of people will say, okay, millennials and Gen Zs lack that sort of systems in their head, and it's like there's some things that are different with the way that younger kids are brought up with technology and environment and being even giving the label impatient. It's just a different focus on how they're brought up and how they see the world. But when you dig down into it, we all have similar brain makeup. We all have an area of our brain in the frontal lobe that develops the empathetic side. And when you look at how they're distinguishing situations with that same mentality, we're all the same. We all want the same goal. So I think hiring is an interesting thing because it does take that level of emotional intelligence first, and then it's the skill set that follows.
Hire for attitude, train for skill.
That's right.
Basically.
I'd say 51-49, 51% emotional, 49 skills. Yeah.
Okay, everybody always asks me this, so I'm going to turn the tables a little bit. Talking about stores, mm-hmm. What do you think the future of physical retail is going to be?
I get asked this question a lot too.
It is the question.
It is the question. And I know your take on this too, because I do a lot of listening and watching and just seeing how people react in this space. And I tend to agree with you and with others that showrooming is the I guess example of retail that will keep living on and actually adding to. I think it's a combination though with showrooming. I think where things and people and groups leverage more on each other, that collaboration will become bigger and bigger in place-based retail. So we see good examples of collaboration all over now, but I think when we start to really experience what is it that gets us out, drives us every day to a place to buy something, it's a collaboration of eating and buying goods. It's a combination of having a service done and buying goods. So collaboration in the same space as showrooming, it will be that ultimate experience.
Yeah, I agree. I listened to a guy from Beta speak once, and they have the ultimate showroom stores, where they have one item there and you test it out and then it gets shipped to your house. Basically, you scan it or whatever technology is used, it gets shipped to your house. And I took him aside and I said, how's it all working? He goes, well, there's some items you have to have inventory, because people go, I want that thing now, and to determine what that is, I think we have a long way to go in terms of showroom stores. Like, what are the things you need some inventory in? What are the things you don't? Bonobos was another showroom store, and they found out the same thing. Like, there's a certain shirt, it's the greatest shirt. People would come in, they try on the shirt. They don't just want to shift it around. They want to wear it now, and they want to wear it to a thing. So
I get that. I do know that there's limitations. So,
Yeah.
but I think that any brand that may have been around for a while now and is finding, I guess, problems in the organization and not being able to operate big box stores they've got to think about things differently. And I know we talk about this internally here as kits of parts versus just a prototype anymore. But one of the things that's really important about a kit of parts and looking at your brand and your company and organization is that you got to think, how do I make these showrooms a small application in different spots of consumer touch points? And it's when you look at urban areas that are more pedestrian, you've got to find a way to make a small space that offers that sort of emotional connection, coming in and touching product, coming in and gaining information from a very empowered associate that can give you any information, and it's only one person that can even do that to you and change your mind and make you a believer of that brand and that product. And it's by making those little kiosks or a little store that has a representation of a story that embodies the whole brand itself. And it has the examples of clothing there. It has examples of fabrics, materials, or scents that buy you into that mentality of that brand. And then ultimately, if you have the ability there to order and send it home to anywhere for free shipping, that's the best of all worlds. But if the idea of walking away with that product is not always possible, but I think you have to think about what products are there and how do you get those in the hands of that person walking out the door so they can share it on the way home or share it with others.
So what's your personal favorite store?
Gosh, there's not a single store that I have as my very personal favorite, but I look at those that are doing what I'm saying very well. I guess when I was in Boulder, Colorado, Rafa there is unbelievable from the sense of creating a lifestyle or adding to your life in the space of a retail store.
Yeah, they're phenomenal.
I mean, community is a huge piece to how do you engage the brand in a kind of in the world, and how do you solicit feedback, and that's one of those examples. One other thing I was thinking about when thinking about community and getting feedback and reviews that hit me is Zara, how they are able to address reviews from those that are wearing their clothing very fast, and their associates are trained to gain this knowledge from their customer and be able to make tweaks to their clothing within weeks and put out something else into the market that's very similar but has those elements of feedback from their core customer is amazing too. So I think that's another example, and their environment and the way that they treat their customer and their brand in general seems to me as a great example. Nike House of Innovation, if anybody's not been there, needs to go see that, because that's, I guess, when you look at how technology can help make the choices in environment, because they've spent so much money in making those digital touch points become easy ways of gaining knowledge and making the choice in store, and creating a lifestyle around exercise and fitness and just sport and the way that their shoes are just so alive is an amazing environment to go see and be a part of. So those are some examples, I think.
Yeah, I think those are good ones. One of my favorite stores, I think, is Stoff's in Grandview.
Like it.
Yeah, because it constantly amazes me how they put so little effort into the actual building itself, but it is packed with people of all ages every single day. Mm-hmm. And it's just kind of based on, conversation and coffee and nothing else, and high margin coffee too, by the way. It's it's one of those things where you keep hitting yourself on the head going, why didn't I do a Stoff? I could have done it anywhere. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing to it.
It seems so easy. I know I love that you go in there and the open beans are there and all the bins. And
so it smells.
Yeah, the smell is amazing. People want to be there. People want to fight for their seat there. I think that's really empowering when you can think of a retail environment that allows that sort of I guess, attractiveness.
Somehow.
It's amazing. God.
Okay, I think we're about out of time here. Anything else you want to add? Andy, anything that's bugging you? Anything you want to talk about?
Nothing that's bugging me. I love for people to embody this sense of emotionally driven design and how empathy can help become a driving force for helping others find their way through business. And I think that the emotional connection is really the biggest thing, and always not from always being positive and always optimistic point of view, but I do embody that sort of spirit. It's always thinking about those that are having success in the world and being able to drive that sort of from an innovation standpoint and always challenging yourself to be uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's a good one. So we don't see like chip implants in WD employees anytime soon.
I don't think so. I hope not. I'm not ready for that.
At ease, everybody, all you WDers. Okay, thank you, Andy. You've been very gracious, truly, and much appreciated. Take the time, come and talk to us. People, be sure and listen next time for some more human interaction on hot topics, and I don't just mean Store of the Future, although I'm sure I'm going to ask about that anyway. Also, be sure and subscribe to this podcast. WDcast is at wdpartners.com. Go to the menu hamburger and hit what we think. Then go to the very bottom of that page, bottom center, and hit the podcast icon and pick one. We've got a ton of stuff to listen to, including Andy here. Google, Huntington Bank. Of course, we had an interview with Alexa and a few other things. So we will talk to you next time. Thank you.